on this episode of Murder Uncovered.
Norwood was where I fell in love. Norwood was a village.
So we've always had serial murder in South Africa.
One of the first serial murderers that flung himself into the public spotlight.
The body of an adult black female was found.
He throttled her, hit her over the head with a brick and set her body alight.
He goes there with the intention to actually rape the victim.
Women moved out, moved in with their parents, with their boyfriends.
He then puts the gun against her head and fires the shot and kills her.
The people in the Norwood community were gobsmacked. They were terrified. They were living on edge. It became a ghost town.
In 1989, South Africa was on the cusp of radical social and political change, a fact that the minority white population would confront in the years to come. The South African police were an instrument used to protect white interests and to uphold the apartheid regime. Although there was a highly efficient policing capability, South Africa was not a country familiar with serial murder.
At the time of the Norwood murder series, which really spanned from 1989 to 1992, South Africa was obviously very much a police state because of its history of apartheid, a lot of investment by the government in policing and policing services. So the quality of investigators was actually very good in general in South Africa at the time. In terms of the forensics capacity, it was obviously sort of late 80s, early 90s. So in South Africa, the typical things would be fingerprints, blood grouping, hair analysis, etc. So I think a lot of the basic forensic capabilities that you would probably have seen in any developed part of the world. Forensic DNA hadn't really yet come to our shores, and that only really started to feature in about the early to mid-90s, when the early version of forensic DNA was starting to be used in South Africa.
The term serial killer had already become very much part of popular culture in America, for example, in Canada, in other countries, but it hadn't been part of popular culture in South Africa. So it was combustible. It was you know, the people in the Norwood community were gobsmacked. They were terrified. They were living on edge.
So we've always had serial murder in South Africa, and we've gone back and looked into our history and found quite a number of cases prior to sort of the early 80s. So it was definitely there. I don't think we had a label for it at that point in time. I don't even think the word serial murder or serial killer was being used. So whether we started to have more serials sort of by the early 90s, or we just realized in the full capability of, or full capacity of what is out there, I think it's probably the second option. You know, I don't think the apartheid police back in the 80s and 70s would really have worried too much about the murder of lots of black females being found out in the open veldt areas, unidentified, decomposed bodies. I don't think we would have focused a lot on those types of cases. In general, as a police service, it might even been picked up as possibly linked to political violence that was taking place.
The Norwood killer was probably at the cusp, or towards the cusp, one of the first serial murderers that flung himself into the public spotlight over that time.
In 1989, 22-year-old Cobus Heldenhuys was a young cop living at the local police barracks in a leafy northern suburb of Johannesburg called Norwood. Cobus was engaged and his future looked bright. However, this only child, whose father had passed away and whose mother played a dominant role in his life, harbored a deep urge that would soon terrify an entire city.
So on the 12th of May, 1989, around about 9 o'clock in the morning, the body of an adult black female was found inside her room. She was a domestic helper at a home, a residential home in Benoni, towards the east of Johannesburg. She was found partially naked on the floor. The top half of her body and portions of the room had been set on fire, and the cause of death appeared to be strangulation and possibly also inhalation of smoke.
She was 22. She was working as a domestic worker for neighbors of his parents, and he climbed over the wall and throttled her, hit her over the head with a brick, and set her body alight.
Cobus Heldenhuys had been watching television at his parents' house that day. He was bored, and he knew that the neighbors were away. He surprised the young Grace Nguvela, proceeding to beat and strangle her to death. He set her body alight before fleeing the scene.
Now, if you look at the police crime scene photograph in 1989, it was a black and white photograph. So what would happen is that black victims would be photographed with black and white film, and white victims would be photographed with colors film. So even you see a bit of the racial dynamics of South Africa at the time interplay in how the police would document crime scenes.
The racial nature of South African society permeated through all things and would certainly have influenced the young Geldenhuys, who would never again burn one of his victims.
He burned her. He might have had sex with her, and maybe he was embarrassed because he was a white cop and she was a black domestic worker.
So this particular crime went unsolved for just over 2 years. Now, whether it was a case of the police not really putting much effort into it, or whether there weren't necessarily lots of forensic clues on this particular crime scene, I'm not too sure.
And at that point, the police couldn't even tell me whether she'd been raped or not. I don't even think they bothered to check.
The fact that the murder of a black female in Johannesburg in 1989 was not going to be a police priority. And so the chance to apprehend Cobus was lost.
So as a profiler, if I look at these crime scene photographs, there are a few things that are already sort of ticking over in my mind. The first thing, obviously, we have nothing stolen from the environment. No items of value were probably in that little room, but nothing was taken that we can see. We have a victim who's naked from the waist down, so automatically I'm thinking of a potential sexual murder. And that is quite common amongst your serial murderers in South Africa, that they would engage in what we call sexual murders. We also see the element of fire on the crime scene. Now, fire, of course, can have a very practical purpose, which is to destroy evidence, but fire can very often also have a psychological motive to it. Sometimes you might be able to figure that out from the crime scene. Sometimes you might only get your final answer when you actually interview the suspect. So again, I think nowadays, as opposed to back in 1989, we would definitely be concerned that this has been a sexually motivated murder, that this could then be something that's going to be repeated again, and we have to look out for that in that general area around this particular crime scene.
I only found out about her after I covered the plethora of rapes and murders in Norwood and outside Norwood. I mean, I only realized then that she had been his first victim.
Grace had certainly been the first to die at the hands of Cobus Geldenhuys, but as the affluent population of Norwood were soon to find out, she wouldn't be the last.
So South Africa in 1989 was really on the cusp of changing. You know, the following year, February 1990, we had Nelson Mandela released. So it was really that point in time where, you know, the apartheid government was sort of very much obviously in power and in force, but realizing that there were certain changes that needed to be made that started to take place in the early 1990s. So I think it was a very dynamic time in South Africa, a lot of change, a lot of political activity taking place, etc. You had obviously the sort of what was seen as the terrorist or the resistance movements, of course, starting to become very vocal and active, a lot of the trade unions becoming very vocal and active. So it was a very exciting time in South Africa in general, but a lot of sort of political activity, a lot of political violence. It was also taking place around that time period.
I was, at the particular time, South Africa was just such a hip and happening place. It was, you know, I would party in Hillbrow and party in Yeoville, and it was quite edgy, but it was such fun, you know. I mean, it would be a little bit like walking on the wild side, which is what I speak about in my book, but it was a melting pot of cultures. And there was an edge of danger, but that made it all the more fascinating and all the more exciting.
Back in the early 90s, Norwood was a nice leafy suburb in Johannesburg. It consisted of lots of blocks of flats, nice residential houses, and a very nice popular street with lots of restaurants and a lot of nightlife. So a lot of young and upcoming people were living in that particular area, and it was pretty much always deemed as a very safe area to actually live in.
Norwood was where I fell in love and where I lived for 8 years. Norwood was a village. It was where I would go to gym. I teach classes at a gym across the road from my flat. It was where I would meet dates for a glass of wine or a cup of coffee. You know, the shop owners knew me by name. They knew which food I liked. It was a wonderful place. Grant Avenue was just such a hub. It was rocking, and it was the best to live there as a single woman.
Norwood also had a very large police station in the suburb. And not only a police station, it had a very big barracks where a lot of policemen who were not married were staying at the time. Some of them worked in various units at the police station or either in the riot squads that were based around Johannesburg.
From the roof of the Norwood Police Barracks, Cobus Geldenhuys had a vantage point from which he could watch the suburb. And for 2 years, he was able to control whatever urges were bubbling up inside him.
In the chronology of this case, we have this 2-year period where, as far as we know, the suspect isn't doing anything. And it is possible that that kind of, for some period of time, satisfied whatever inner urges there were taking place within himself, or his life was perhaps going a bit more in accordance to what he wanted, but there was that 2-year gap. Then we slowly start to see him edging back into putting his foot into sort of criminal activity. And that's quite common what we see with serials, is that they're often what we call trial runs, where they start to sort of push the boundaries in the direction of what they're ultimately going to do, which, for example, could be a rape and a murder. But they might start out, like in this case, when the person is attacking people in their homes, with firstly engaging in break-ins, often what we refer to as sexual burglaries, because they're not really motivated by stealing something of value. They're really more motivated by that person getting some kind of a kick out of the process of breaking into someone's flat.
Motivated by his emerging fantasies, Geldenhuys began to break into homes, committing petty theft, surveilling the neighborhood, slowly but surely growing bolder.
And again, it's like putting your toe in the water to see how it goes, what happens, are there people there, are there not people there, that kind of excitement around the crime. But then you're going to, of course, push that boundary a little further. And with our suspect in this case, that further boundary started to become the raping of victims. On the 4th of November 1991, we have our first, perhaps serious case starting to take place. The suspect breaks into a 35-year-old female's flat. He steals some CDs again, a little CD player, and he also takes the victim's BMW, which is parked downstairs. Now, at this point, there's nobody at home, so it's essentially a housebreaking that's taken place and a theft of a vehicle. What he ultimately did was park that vehicle at the police station's barracks, where he was staying. Then on the following night, he brings the vehicle back, parks it downstairs, and throws the keys into the flats, through the flat's window. Then the following night, in other words, the 3rd time that he's been back at the same flat, he goes there with the intention to actually rape the victim.
Finally, on the 6th of November at approximately 3 a.m., Cobus Geldenhuys returns to the same house for the 3rd time, where he rapes its 35-year-old occupant.
He says he didn't kill this particular victim because the lights were off and she couldn't identify him.
Unlike the murder of a black female, the rape of a young white woman in her home is the kind of crime that would have immediately gotten the attention of local law enforcement. Despite this, Geldenhuys, a cop himself, was soon to strike again.
So 20 days later, on the 26th of November 1991, at about 2 o'clock in the morning, the suspect gains access through the victim's window of her flat, and he comes across a 68-year-old female who lived there. Now, he'd actually been in that flat on a previous occasion and stole money out of a handbag. So this was the 2nd time now that he's going back with the intention now to rape the victim. He hits her over the head with the butt of his gun, he undresses her, he gets undressed himself, he rapes her. After he's finished with that initial rape, he asks her if she has any money, then he rapes her a 2nd time. Now, during the actual rape process, I think out of fear, she said to him, you know, can I tickle your backside? So there was a bit of interaction taking place. And once he'd finished with that particular rape, he didn't leave with any sort of items that he stole. He said to her, good night.
With a series of rapes now beginning to rock the quiet Norwood community, it isn't long before local crime journalist Janine Lazarus is hauled into her editor's office.
The case came onto the radar because the late editor, who I would have lived and died for, of the now defunct Sunday Star, Dave Hazelhurst Hazy, I missed 2 rapes happening within my neighborhood. and he asked me, he said, and he bashed his fist against the desk in the middle of, everybody was watching me, and he said, "You call yourself a chief crime reporter." I'd missed 2 rapes that had happened within a 2.5 kilometer radius of my flat. So I limpingly left the newsroom and picked up on the pieces. I phoned the police, the General Police Line of Inquiries. I went to Brixton Murder and Robbery Squad. I spoke to Sergeant John Miles from the Norwood Police Station, and eventually I pieced together that there was a prowler in Norwood.
In fact, the prowler, who had already evolved from petty theft to rape, would soon seek out even darker ways to satisfy a growing thirst.
The case quickly gathered momentum. I pretty much put through a couple of calls to the General Police Line of Inquiries, to Brixton Murder and Robbery Squad, to Norwood. Back in the 80s, early 90s, they were still seen as the apartheid cops. And I would work very closely with them at Brixton Murder and Robbery Squad and East Rand Murder and Robbery Squad, and also in the Cape Flats. And they had an incredibly notorious reputation. They were also known as some of the best cops around. Piet Bielefeld, the serial killer cop. They were crack detectives, but they had some very dubious means at kind of the net closing in, if you like, or getting their guy. My relationship with them, they were fine if I was reporting on how well they did. They weren't that great when I reported on how badly they did. And one of the investigations that I believe they bungled was the Norwood killer case.
Now hot on the story, Janine quickly ascertained that there was indeed a prowler using the same modus operandi to break into flats around the increasingly tense suburb of Norwood.
He would climb up first-floor drain pipes, get into the bedroom window, pistol whip his victims, rape them, generally have a sip of orange juice or milk from the fridge, or bite into bologna or cheese in the fridge, leaving his DNA all over the place, wish his victims a good night, sometimes tuck them in, and then slip outside. And those were the stories that I started running, and Norwood quickly became a suburb under siege. I mean, if you take a drive where I lived, right at the corner of Grant Avenue and Iris Road, you will still see the razor wire. I mean, there would be 7 women driving around in a car at 3 o'clock in the morning, too scared to go home. Women moved out, moved in with their parents, with their boyfriends. They would come home and feed their cats and water their plants. So it became a ghost town at that particular point. I mean, the entire Norwood was everybody was panic-stricken. The only business doing any kind of cash turnover was the security business. So it was a suburb that was completely under siege.
Gossip permeated Norwood. Rumors that the rapist was using the police barracks as a vantage point from which to scout out victims. Janine was soon to confirm that the police themselves were beginning to suspect that the culprit was one of their own.
So from the rape of the 68-year-old woman on the 26th of November, we jump forward about 20 days to the 16th of December. And what we have is a 27-year-old female who was at home in the house that she stayed in. Now, this was a few blocks away from the flats where he had previously committed his crimes. It's what we call a commune, which was a bunch of young people living together. Some of them were students, etc. So it was a nice house in that particular suburb. Now, our suspect had actually been in that house, or on that premises, about 5 times before the actual murder took place. He'd been there when people were having a braai, which is a South African version of a barbecue. He'd been in the property to use it as a springboard to get into a neighboring property. He'd been inside a little flatlet that's on the premises before. So he was quite intimate with that particular space and who was also living there. And he'd actually even identified this bedroom that he went into on the day of the actual murder.
Her name was Julia Hitchie. She was a pharmacy consultant, I think. She had short, dark hair. Beautiful smile. I remember it because we featured it in the Sunday Star.
So he walks down the passage, the second door on the left is open, he goes inside and he sees a young woman asleep in her bed. He switches on the light, He pulls her duvet off a little bit and she sits up and screams, and he hits her twice on the head with his service pistol. He then undresses her and he partially undresses himself. But he tries to engage in sexual act in rape with this particular victim, and he premature ejaculates. And while he's still on top of her, and she hasn't said a word at all during this whole particular process, he then puts the gun against her head and fires the shot and kills her.
Duncan, her housemate, left for work in the morning and saw, that Julia's light was still on in her bedroom, and he thought she had just slept in. So he left for work, and when he got home that night at 5 p.m, the phone was ringing, and it was a call for Julia. And he looked at the bedroom, and the light was still on. And he opened the bedroom door, and he saw her body lying on the bed. He thought she had a nosebleed because her head was lying back at an unnatural angle, and he realized that she'd been killed.
Now, if I look at what's taken place so far in Norwood, excluding the Benoni murder that took place 2 years prior, we have 2 women being raped in a small geographical area, a short time frame from each other, and then we have a third case, which is a sexual murder, a rape and murder of a young lady in the houses nearby. What we often do see with our serial murderers is that they'll start with a rape or 1 or 2 rapes and then escalate into a rape murder. And again, that's part of this whole process of trial runs, pushing the boundaries, testing your internal limits as to what you can deal with before you step into what you finally ultimately wanted to do, which will be, for example, a rape and murder. So again, it's very understandable and relatable in terms of what we see in other types of murder series that are taking place. So without a doubt, in the sort of modern way of looking at this, we would definitely have said we have to be careful about future cases happening, and they're probably going to be rape murders, and it's probably going to be in the same geographical area as what we have seen to that particular point in time.
News of the killing would soon rock the quiet suburb of Norwood. A serial rapist had now taken his first steps into murder, and it would only be a matter of time before his desire for power and blood would once again need to be satisfied. Next time on Murder Uncovered.
The ultimate sense of control over another person is to actually take their life.
He just didn't discriminate. The same man who'd been prowling Norwood and who'd raped the 35-year-old and the 68-year-old had now morphed into a rapist killer. He smoked a cigarette, he put the cigarette out on the tiles of the bath, and he shot her in the face.
He's the kind of person, and perhaps one can say this about all serial murderers, that once you're a killer of that nature, you'll always be a killer.